The ocean has a way of silencing the world, but in the autumn of 1928, the silence along the northern seaboard was replaced by something far more unsettling. It wasn't a roar, and it wasn't a scream. It was a hum, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate not in the ears, but in the marrow of the bone. For the residents of isolated fishing villages from the craggy reaches of Maine down to the fog-drenched Massachusetts capes, the sound became a constant, invisible companion. At first, it was dismissed as the natural mechanics of a modernizing coast. The 1920s were, after all, a decade of transition, where the ancient traditions of the sea were colliding with the relentless march of industrial engineering. But as the weeks pressed on, the hum began to pull at the fabric of daily life. Men in the taverns spoke of shadows that moved against the wind. Keepers of the light reported sightings of vessels that weren't on the charts, ships that sailed through solid rock and vanished into the spray. Records suggest that by late October, the phenomenon was no longer a localized curiosity. It had become a regional crisis, one that the authorities were desperate to categorize, yet utterly failed to contain. The archives of the United States Lighthouse Service, now yellowed and brittle, contain frantic entries from men known for their stoicism. These were men trained to withstand isolation, yet their handwriting in the fall of 1928 tells a story of profound psychological collapse. They weren't just hearing things, they were seeing a world that shouldn't exist. And while the official reports would later point to mass hysteria or maritime fatigue, a closer look at the technical specifications of the era reveals a more disturbing possibility. It wasn't the fog they were afraid of. It was the sound designed to lead them through it. But that wasn't the strangest part. To understand what happened in 1928, one must understand the environment of the North Atlantic coast during the interwar period. This was a landscape defined by its hostility. The graveyard of the Atlantic required more than just lights. It required a voice. Since the mid-19th century, fog signals had evolved from simple bells to steam-powered whistles, and finally to the diaphone. This was a massive, compressed air instrument capable of producing a low, guttural blast. The iconic Beagle sound that could be heard for 20 miles. In 1927, a new experimental frequency was introduced to the Type F diaphone units being installed across the northern districts. The goal was simple: lower the frequency to better penetrate the dense, heavy air of a North Atlantic gale. Lower frequencies travel further with less dissipation. It was a triumph of engineering. However, the engineers of the time were working with an incomplete understanding of psychoacoustics. They were focused on the distance the sound could travel, not the effect it would have on the human nervous system once it arrived. Historical blueprints of the 1928 installations show a modification to the vertical resonators designed to drop the pitch to approximately 27.5 Hz. This is right on the edge of human hearing, hovering in the realm of infrasound. It is a frequency that the body feels as much as it hears. Some modern researchers believe that this specific pitch was capable of triggering a phenomenon known as resonant frequency of the eye. At roughly 18 to 19 Hz, the human eyeball begins to vibrate, causing smears in the peripheral vision, ghostly shapes, flickering shadows, and the sensation of movement where there is none. But in 1928, the residents of the coast didn't have a name for it. They only knew that the fog had started to play tricks on them. And that's when things began to shift. The first documented case of what would become known as the Siren Delirium occurred at the Monhegan Island Light. The keeper, a veteran of 20 years named Elias Thorne, began recording strange observations in his daily log. On October 12th, he noted that the new diaphone signal was exceptionally clear, but complained of a persistent pressure in his chest. By the 14th, his entries became erratic. He wrote of the gray men walking across the surf figures that seemed to emerge from the very crests of the waves, tall and translucent, moving with a synchronicity that defied the chaos of the ocean. Thorne wasn't alone. In the village below, the wives of the lobstermen reported a shared dream. A city of copper towers rising out of the Gulf of Maine, flickering in and out of existence with every blast of the foghorn. What makes these records so compelling isn't the presence of ghosts, but the uniformity of the visions. In psychological circles, mass hallucinations usually vary wildly from person to person, shaped by individual fears and backgrounds. Yet, from Monhegan to Gloucester, the reports were eerily consistent. People saw the same copper towers. They heard the same metallic chanting beneath the roar of the surf. There is no clear consensus among historians as to why these specific images manifested, but some suggest that the frequency didn't just vibrate the eyes. It may have been subtly altering the brain's theta waves, the state associated with deep dreaming and REM sleep. The coastal population wasn't just awake. They were dreaming while their eyes were open. As the calendar turned to November, the atmosphere along the coast grew heavy with an unspoken dread. The fishing fleets, usually eager to make their final hauls before the winter ice, began to stay in port. The men claimed the sea didn't look right. They described the water as having the consistency of oil, reflecting stars that weren't in the sky. In the town of Matinicus, a group of residents gathered at the town hall to demand the lighthouse keeper shut off the signal. They claimed the sound was rotting the air. But the keepers were under federal orders. The shipping lanes were crowded, and the fog was relentless that year. To silence the siren was to condemn hundreds of sailors to the rocks. The sound had to continue. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. On the night of November 4th, the great fog rolled in a bank of mist so thick that it was said a man couldn't see his own hand at arm's length. Across the northern seaboard, the Type F diaphones began their synchronized dance, a chorus of low-frequency pulses that shook the very foundations of the coastal cottages. It was during this 48-hour period that the hallucinations peaked. In a small hamlet near Point Judith, every dog in the village reportedly began to howl in unison, refusing to stop until their throats bled. People shuttered their windows, not to keep out the cold, but to dampen the vibration that made the china rattle on the shelves and the blood thrum in their temples. An investigator from the Department of Commerce, sent to oversee the new installations, recorded a chilling observation in a private letter to his wife. He wrote that while standing near the resonator at Whaleback Light, he felt a sense of profound displacement. He described the sensation of being in two places at once, standing on the cold gallery of the lighthouse, while simultaneously walking through a forest of unnatural geometry. He noted that the other men on the gallery appeared to be having the same experience. They were staring into the fog with expressions of rapturous terror, their lips moving in silent conversation with things that weren't there. He wrote, "The sound is a key, and I fear it has unlocked a door we were never meant to open." But as the investigator prepared to file his official report, the situation transitioned from a psychological curiosity to a physical catastrophe. The catastrophe began not with a bang, but with a disappearance. On the morning of November 7th, the SS Montauk, a coastal steamer carrying 64 passengers and a crew of 20, was navigating the waters off the coast of Maine. According to the logs of the nearby Boone Island Light, the sea was calm, though the fog remained an impenetrable wall. The Montauk was heard sounding its own whistle, responding to the rhythmic, low-frequency pulse of the shore-based diaphone. Watchmen on the coast reported hearing the steamer's whistle growing closer. Then suddenly, the foghorn emitted a blast of unprecedented intensity, a sound so powerful it was said to have shattered windows 3 miles inland. When the sound died away, the Montauk's whistle was gone. The ship never arrived at its destination. No wreckage was found. No bodies ever washed ashore. For days, the Coast Guard searched the area, but it was as if the vessel had simply been erased from the map. But that wasn't the strangest part. In the weeks following the disappearance, Telegrams began to arrive at the shipping company's office in Portland. They were fragments of distress calls, supposedly from the Montauk, but they weren't transmitted via standard radio frequencies. They were being picked up by primitive crystal radio sets in rural farmhouses miles from the coast. The messages were nonsensical, described by those who heard them as layered or echoing. The voices didn't plead for rescue from the water. They spoke of a heavy sky and a sea made of glass. Modern analysts looking back at these telegrams have noted a chilling detail. The timestamps of these messages suggested they were being sent hours, sometimes days, after the ship had vanished. There is no clear consensus on how this was possible, though some historians suggest that the massive acoustic energy of the 1928 Siren may have been interacting with the ionosphere in ways the technology of the time couldn't measure. As the search for the Montauk continued, the physical effects on the coastal population grew more severe. It was no longer just a matter of shadows in the fog. In the town of Cape Elizabeth, a local physician named Dr. Aristone began documenting a condition he called the shiver. Patients arrived at his clinic with ruptured eardrums, but they reported no pain. Instead, they complained that their internal clock was wrong. They would sit in his waiting room for 5 minutes and believe hours had passed. Or conversely, they would stand for hours in the town square, convinced they had only been there for a moment. Aristone's private journals, discovered in the 1970s, suggest he believed the frequency was causing a localized disruption in the perception of time. He noted that the constant 27.5 Hertz pulse seemed to be syncing the human heart rate to the rhythm of the machine. And that's when things began to shift. Internal documents from the Lighthouse Service indicate that by mid-November the government was aware that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the new frequency. A team of engineers was dispatched from Washington, D.C., but they didn't come to fix the sirens. They came to observe. These men were seen at various stations along the coast, carrying brass instruments and heavy lead-lined cases. They didn't speak to the locals. They ignored the frantic pleas of the lighthouse keepers who were, by this point, suffering from chronic insomnia and terrifying auditory hallucinations. One surviving photograph from this period shows an engineer standing at the base of the Portland Head Light, staring out at a sea that is completely obscured by fog. His expression is one of cold, clinical detachment, even as a crowd of residents protested behind him, claiming that the siren was calling the dead out of the deep. The turning point occurred on November 19th at a remote station known as Blackwood Ledge. The keeper there, a man named Thomas Vance, had been silent for 4 days. When a supply boat finally managed to dock, they found the lighthouse in a state of impossible disarray. The interior walls were covered in intricate, geometric patterns scratched into the stone with what appeared to be a piece of sharpened iron. Vance was found in the lantern room, but he wasn't dead. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes wide and fixed on the horizon. According to the rescuers' reports, Vance didn't respond to his name or to physical touch. He seemed to be in a deep catatonic state, but his body was vibrating. The rescuers claimed they could feel the hum emanating from his skin. When they tried to move him, he allegedly whispered a single phrase: "The frequency is the floor." What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Behind the lens of the Blackwood light, the engineers found a modification that hadn't been in the original blueprints. Someone or something had altered the resonator. The lead line cases the Washington officials had brought weren't for equipment. They were for the removal of certain components that were never officially documented. Records suggest that the experimental 1928 frequency wasn't just a low-frequency sound wave. It was part of a broader, more secretive study into long-distance acoustic communication, possibly for military applications that predated the development of radar. But the Blackwood incident suggested that the experiment had transcended its original parameters. The sound wasn't just traveling through the air. It was resonating with the very geology of the coast. The lighthouses were built on granite, a stone known for its piezoelectric properties. When subjected to mechanical stress, granite can generate an electric charge. The 27.5 Hertz pulse of the sirens was, in effect, turning the entire northern seaboard into a massive, low-frequency transmitter. This would explain the crystal radio interference, and it might explain the shared visions of copper towers. Some modern researchers believe that the residents weren't hallucinating ghosts. They were experiencing a form of tectonic strain induced by the sound, which caused the atmosphere to glow and the mind to fracture. But while this provides a scientific framework, it doesn't account for the most disturbing aspect of the 1928 event, the accounts of the second coast. Throughout late November, multiple witnesses independent of one another and separated by hundreds of miles described seeing a second coastline appearing in the distance during the siren's blast. This wasn't a mirage of a distant shore, but a mirror image of the very coast they stood upon, only wrong. The buildings were shaped differently. The trees were gnarled in impossible ways, and the sky was a bruised, iridescent purple. Some historians believe these accounts were the result of extreme psychological stress, but the consistency of the descriptions is difficult to dismiss. They weren't seeing a different place. They were seeing their own world through a distorted lens created by the vibration. And for some, the transition between these two worlds became all too real. In Gloucester, a fishing captain named Elias Coffin reportedly sailed his vessel, the Hesperus II, directly into one of these mirage coastlines. His crew, terrified, watched as the ship seemed to slide into a pocket of light that shouldn't have existed. For 3 minutes, the Hesperus II was visible to the shore-bound witnesses, but it appeared to be sailing on a sea that was tilted at a 45-degree angle. Then, as the foghorn's blast ended, the ship snapped back into reality. But when the crew returned to the docks, they were changed. They refused to speak about what they had seen, and within a week, every single man on that boat had moved inland, vowing never to look at the ocean again. The Hesperus II itself was found to be covered in a fine metallic dust that defied chemical analysis at the time. What happened next remains unclear, as the official records for that week in Gloucester are curiously missing from the National Archives. By the end of November, the situation had reached a breaking point. The Siren Delirium was no longer a secret. Newspapers were beginning to pick up the story, though their reports were heavily censored by the Department of Commerce under the guise of national maritime security. The public was told that a rare atmospheric phenomenon was causing temporary bouts of vertigo. But the residents knew better. They knew that the sound was changing them. It was reported that in several coastal towns, people had begun to speak a new language, a series of rhythmic clicks and hums that mimicked the pulse of the diaphone. The social fabric of the northern seaboard was unraveling, and the government realized that the experiment had to be terminated before the collapse became permanent. On the night of December 2nd, 1928, the silence returned as abruptly as it had been broken. Without warning or public announcement, the Department of Commerce ordered the immediate deactivation of the Type F experimental resonators across all northern districts. The engineers who had spent weeks lurking in the shadows of the lighthouse galleries vanished overnight, taking their lead-lined cases and brass instruments with them. For the residents of the coast, the sudden absence of the 27.5 Hertz pulse was almost as jarring as its arrival. People described a sensation of falling as the vibration left their bones. Some remained in a state of lethargy for weeks, unable to adjust to a world that no longer hummed. But that wasn't the strangest part. When the signals were eventually restored a month later, they were different. Technical logs from the early 1930s show that the frequency had been shifted upward, well into the audible range, and the power output had been significantly throttled. The era of the low-frequency experiment was over. Officially, the government cited mechanical inefficiency and unforeseen maintenance costs as the reasons for the change. But the paper trail suggests a more urgent motive. Internal memos recovered decades later via the Freedom of Information Act reveal that the Lighthouse Service had been inundated with reports of environmental instability and unaccounted for biological anomalies. The experiment hadn't failed because it didn't work. It had failed because it worked too well. In the aftermath, the northern seaboard entered a period of collective amnesia. The Siren Delirium was rarely spoken of in the decades that followed. Families who had witnessed the copper towers or the shifting coastlines tucked those memories away, treating them like a shared fever dream. The disappearance of the SS Montauk remained an unsolved mystery, eventually relegated to the annals of maritime folklore alongside the Mary Celeste. However, modern re-examinations of the 1,928 events have provided a new lens through which to view the tragedy. We now know more about the effects of infrasound on the human psyche than the engineers of the 1920s ever could have imagined. Research conducted in the late 20th century has confirmed that frequencies between 7 and 20 Hz can induce feelings of profound sorrow, anxiety, and even chills. More importantly, experiments in psychoacoustics have shown that certain low-frequency tones can cause the fluid in the inner ear to vibrate in a way that disrupts the brain's ability to process spatial orientation. Some historians believe that the 1,928 frequency didn't just cause hallucinations. It physically altered the way the brain mapped its surroundings. If the sound was powerful enough, it might have created a sensory feedback loop where the brain, unable to make sense of the vibrating world, began to fill the gaps with images from the subconscious. This would explain the uniformity of the visions, a shared cultural vocabulary of the era, projected onto the blank canvas of the fog. What they found next, however, continues to challenge even the most rational explanations. In the mid-1990s, a team of oceanographers mapping the seafloor off the coast of Maine discovered a series of unusual magnetic anomalies near the last known coordinates of the SS Montauk. These anomalies don't match the signature of a shipwreck. Instead, they suggest a localized distortion in the Earth's magnetic field, concentrated around a cluster of granite outcroppings. Some believe these are the tectonic remnants of the 1,928 experiment, the lingering effects of a coastline that was vibrated so intensely it changed its own physical properties. There is no clear consensus on whether the frequency could have actually opened a door, as the investigator at Whaleback Light had feared, or if it simply broke the minds of those who heard it. Today, the lighthouses of the northern seaboard are mostly automated. The massive diaphones have been replaced by sleek, electronic signals that emit a polite, harmless beep. The granite cliffs are silent, and the great fog of 1,928 has long since dissipated into history. Yet, for those who study the archives, the questions remain. Was the Siren Delirium a tragic mistake of early engineering, or was it a deliberate attempt to see what lies beyond the threshold of human perception? There are still nights, when the air is heavy and the tide is high, when the locals claim they can feel a faint pulse in the ground, a ghost of a sound that shouldn't exist. What happened across those 6 weeks in 1928 serves as a chilling reminder of the thin line between technology and the unknown. We trust our senses to tell us what is real, but as the residents of the Maine coast discovered, reality is only as stable as the frequencies that surround us. The ocean remains a place of deep silence and deeper secrets, and perhaps it is better that way. Because if the archives tell us anything, it's that some sounds are not meant to be heard, and some doors, once unlocked, can never truly be closed.